I'm super excited to have you on, Brianne. I'm curious, where does the Ethique story begin?
Ooh, so Ethique began, I guess, look, a long time ago, probably as a kid, the idea of creating a business that was more about people and planet than it was about money. But I was studying at university. I think I would have been early 20s, studying in Christchurch in New Zealand, living in a flat, and it started in the kitchen. So it began with a microwave, this big idealistic dream that I wanted to rid the world of plastic bottles, and no real idea how I was going to go and achieve that, but here we are.
That's amazing. So I have to ask, so for folks that are listening that, like you, have a dream and are just like, I don't even know where to begin, it just feels like too big and overwhelming. What's your advice for them to get started?
Honestly, it's the Nike slogan. Just do it. I know that sounds like such a trite response, but lots of people get bogged down with the where do I start? And it's very much confidence comes as you do something. Everybody knows this, you know. So if you just do something towards that goal, no matter how big that goal is, if you just do something, you build confidence for the second step. So you can reserve an Instagram handle if you're looking for a business. You can go and talk to a lawyer about, say, IP protection. Just do a little small thing that is not massively expensive or hugely overwhelming, because that one step will say, you've started, and that is you kind of overcoming a mental block. You don't have to start with this big flash plan. In fact, I recommend that you don't. But just do something that is a step towards that goal. Everything you ever want to do should be broken down into little steps and approach it one bite at a time.
That's amazing. That's great advice. So what were the first few steps for you?
I'm not really a patient person, so it was kind of, I'm going to do everything at once. So Ethique is technically my third business. Well, I guess my third real business. So I'd kind of gone through a little bit of this beforehand. I think the first thing I did was bought a whole bunch of ingredients from a cosmetic supplier locally. And I think I went and started building a website. Didn't do any of the stuff you should do, like talking to an accountant or talking to a lawyer. I didn't do any of that. But it worked out okay. But yeah, to me, it's very important to have the product sorted before the exciting bit starts. To me, product development is very exciting, but a lot of people will go and get held up on how they're going to look, their logo looks like, what their color, what their branding is, all of those sorts of things, without thinking about their product. I see a surprising number of people like that. So priorities would be another comment I would make there.
That makes a lot of sense. So I'm curious, how does Ethique do beauty and household cleaning differently?
Well, back in 2012, your only real options were liquid products. And obviously that sounds normal because all hygiene products are liquid, right? So we do everything solid. And we do that for a variety of reasons. The number one reason back then being that if we remove the water, we could then package it, say a solid shampoo bar or a solid conditioner or a solid moisturizer. You could package it in cardboard packaging, which was then compostable. So there was absolutely no consumer waste. Everyone says, why on earth does this matter? Because plastic is recyclable. But there was a stat released actually 2 days ago that 79% of all plastic that was recyclable has ended up in landfill. There is another stat that's sort of slightly larger, but all plastic ever made, only 9% of it is being recycled. At the end of the day, unfortunately, recycling isn't working. So I didn't want to go that route. So we do it with much less water. We don't use the ingredients people typically want to avoid these days. But we also come at from a science perspective, so we don't use any fear-mongering and that sort of stuff to advertise. But the biggest thing that I'm the proudest of, putting aside the environmental credentials, is our social procurement. So the idea of fair trade, direct trade with producers and growers around the world to ensure they get paid a fair price and treated fairly, which is something that is really rare, unfortunately, in our planet as we speak.
Yeah, that's super real. I'm curious, kind of digging a little deeper on that environmental thread. Let's talk a little bit about the huge amount of plastic waste kind of threatening the planet. How did this come onto your radar and feel so urgent for you?
I don't know. I get asked these sorts of questions quite often, and I don't know when I started caring about plastic. There wasn't any defining moment, like it wasn't the seahorse gripped onto the earbud or the awful video with the straw and the turtle. There's no defining moment like that I can remember. but I have always been very passionate about the environment because I'm weirdly obsessed with animals. I have been since I can remember. And I guess one flows into the other. You want to protect where they live, of course. So honestly, I don't know. I've just always been aware that plastic is not the solution. Recycling is not going to help us with the plastic pollution issue. And therefore, how can we get rid of it? We can't get rid of plastic in general. It is far too useful as a product, but single-use plastic we should be doing better.
Absolutely. I'd like to hear a little bit more about the fair trade and how that has kind of folded into your business too.
That was one of the earliest initiatives. It sounds so corporate. One of the earliest things we did as well. It would have been probably 2014. We were still making, like 5 kg batches a day. We were not making a lot of bars at all. We're very, very micro business. But I realized that one of the biggest ways businesses can make a difference socially is through their supply chain. Supply chains are murky. They are disgusting. I mean, you only need to look at things like fast fashion, which everyone goes on about. But really, these sorts of practices are rife in almost every industry. And I didn't want any part of it. So I wanted to find the ingredient we used the most at that point in time was coconut oil, and I wanted to find a fair trade supplier. So I Googled it and found nothing. I reached out to our MFAT, so our Ministry of Foreign Aid and Trade, Foreign Affairs and Trade, and asked if they knew any suppliers, and they pointed me to a cooperative in Samoa. And basically ever since then, I went over and visited them. I saw how they work. I saw that they have the whole value chain. So there's lots of organizations, and I don't like this either, where they will, people from different countries will go into a nation where its economy is developing, right? And they will set up a business and employ locals for it, but they are not capturing the value chain within that community. That is not fair trade, in my opinion. So I wanted to work directly with producers and growers and ensure they were capturing the whole value chain, that we weren't just buying, say, the coconuts, to ensure that they were really being looked after. And that is the philosophy which we source our ingredients today. So now we work with growers in Rwanda and Ghana for cocoa butter, because child labour is rife in cocoa butter. Like every bite of chocolate you've probably ever had has had something to do with child labour, unless you look specifically for certifications. And it's just, that is the way business should be done. As idealistic as that sounds.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And how did you navigate, so it sounds like you went directly to these places. Is that what really has to happen in order for folks to really understand what's happening on the ground? Because it sounds like there are lots of ways that, people are still using some of these harmful practices, but making it look maybe not as bad as it is.
There's a lot of greenwashing in every industry, right? And the beauty industry is far from beautiful. But I would say yes, in an ideal world, you'd be able to visit your growers ideally once a year, and the word audit's a bit unfriendly, but go and make sure that you are dealing with the people who are producing the product and therefore keeping the money. That's not necessarily realistic, particularly right now. I can't go anywhere, and I don't know when that will change. Obviously the world is in a different place than it was a few years ago. So you've got to rely on relationships with people, certifications to a degree, although certifications are out of the reach of some communities because of costs and compliance requirements. So yes, ideal world, yes, you go and visit them, and you would do so regularly. You have a relationship with them. Right now, that's probably a bit more difficult for companies looking to implement this. So perhaps certifications are the best option to ensure that you're really following a best practice.
That makes sense. Sorry, bear with me. So can you talk to us a little bit about some of the challenges of running a plastic-free business?
How long have you got?
All the time in the world.
Yeah, manufacturing without plastic is tricky for a variety of reasons. To start with, I can't tell you the number of people who said, oh, you can't make a product like that. We don't have machinery that will make a product like that. We manufacture our solid shampoo bars very differently to 98% of the other companies in the market. A lot of companies have recently popped up, and they use probably a much cleverer, simpler way of doing it, but it just narrows the things you can do with the formula a little bit more. So I didn't want to go that route. So we've had a lot of pushback from just trying to make the product. So that's number one. Was scaling up, and manufacturing it at mass scale has been very difficult, but we've got there. The next big one would be getting people on board. That is proving less difficult now because people are more and more aware of the plastic crisis, as I know it might sound a little bit overstated, but frankly it is. If I've always believed if people understand something, they're far more likely to work with you alongside it. If you just tell people what to do, you're just going to have to manage them forever. And that's a silly way of managing stuff. So whenever we work with a partner, we always try and, if they're not already there with us on this belief, we want to educate them and work with them to understand why we believe that plastic should be removed from as many places as possible. And that was tricky probably up to about 3 years ago when we got to a size and scale where people started listening to us, but also more and more public education was out there about how bad our environment is looking. But changing people's mindsets has been a big challenge, but it is getting easier.
And changing people's mindsets, it sounds like in the actual supply chain and manufacturing chain, yes. Is that where it's been the hardest, or like consumers, or
no,
both?
Consumers are so switched on. And I know people in the supply chain are therefore consumers, but it is easier to have these beliefs in a personal capacity. It's harder to necessarily follow them. It's easier to have these beliefs when you take them into your workplace and try and create change within, say, a large organization. That's very difficult. But through our work with one of the largest warehouses in the United States, they've decided to transition entirely to a plastic-free. And whilst they've been delayed several times in doing so, they are working towards it specifically because they now understand why we should be doing that. There is a caveat, of course, is plastic-free as a whole isn't necessarily the most environmentally friendly solution. A lot of people say, okay, well, I can't use plastic, so instead I'll use wood. Well, where's that wood come from? Is that wood actually sustainably sourced? When we make these changes, we need to be very careful that we are not just using, not just a knee-jerk reaction. We are doing something that is better. Reusable bags would be a good example. Everybody leapt from plastic bags to reusable, whether it be polypropylene or jute bags. But now we have so many reusable bags that it's actually created more of a resource issue, and that's not really something most people know. So that's an example.
Oh, wow. So in terms of replacing plastic, do you have other materials that you would say are a great place to start looking at replacements?
Yeah, I mean, it totally depends on what issue you're trying to resolve. Things like bamboo, which is technically a grass and one of the fastest growing plants in the world, is something very useful, and it's there's lots more technology and development going into making product with it. Seaweed or algae is a very, I wouldn't say it's necessarily new, but there's some new startups on the horizon that are doing some very interesting things with plastic-like films, which are genuinely biodegradable. So that's very interesting. There's some very cool companies around. So it really depends on what you're trying to achieve as to what you need.
That's really cool. I'm curious, do you know the names of any of those companies doing algae stuff off the top of your head?
Yes, or not PLA. They're UK based. They're very cool. If you recall, cool. I don't know if you would have seen it, but a few years ago, I think it was the London Marathon, they had balls of water for the runners. So you would literally put the entire ball, a sphere filled with water in your mouth, and you could eat the algae skin. That's them. It's called Oho, I think that product was. It was very cool.
Oh my goodness, that is so cool.
Yeah.
That is really cool. I'll definitely check them out. So I'm curious, what can people inside the beauty and household cleaning industry be doing better?
Number one, I think, is probably being honest. So it is, and I understand the temptation. You want to appear that you're doing everything right, which is where greenwashing comes from, because consumers are rightfully demanding better of their brands. So it's very hard for brands to fix everything. Nigh on impossible to fix everything at once. It's very hard, particularly for those bigger brands. How on earth do you turn a ship that large to go in the other direction? So they deliberately mislead, or maybe not deliberately, but they mislead their consumers in a lot of ways. They're far better off saying, hey, we know this is an issue and we're working on it, and here is our steps, and we aim to have this problem fixed by 2022. And short dates, not, this whole carbon neutral by 2050 nonsense. And also start small. It is super overwhelming. And now I'm talking more to sort of small to medium enterprises. It's super overwhelming to say, right, I'm going to be a sustainable enterprise right now. Pick something Product reevaluation can be very difficult depending on what your product is. So perhaps pick your procurement policies. Do we ensure physically by going there or through certifications that our supply chain is entirely child labour free? Again, you will be surprised. The majority of supply chains won't be. Do we start offsetting our carbon emissions and start measuring them? Every company needs to be doing this, and it's going to be mandated by law in most countries within the next few years anyway, so you may as well get the jump on it. Am I counting our carbon emissions? Am I trying to lower them? And then what I cannot offset, or what I cannot minimize, because you can't minimize everything, am I offsetting? And of course, that comes with a cost. So all of these things need to be weighed up. But I guess it's a little bit like the how do you start a business question. It's a small step at a time. If you try and do everything, like overhauling your life, right? You'll just fail.
That makes sense. I'm curious, how about those outside the industry, like regular consumers? What can consumers be doing to kind of cut down on waste?
I really don't think the onus should be on consumers. You see a lot of frustration and guilt and people who are anxious or apathetic because all of the information about how bad our environment is getting is fired at consumers. So instead of consumers saying, I'm not doing enough, 2 weeks ago I had a takeaway coffee cup, whatever, that shouldn't be the attitude we're looking at. We shouldn't be looking at consumers to fix this problem. We should be looking at businesses. Businesses largely created the environmental and social problems we face to a degree. Therefore, the onus should be on them to fix them. They're also the ones with the greatest share of finance to actually make a difference. So consumers should be absolutely using their voice and boycotting brands who don't care and don't do anything. And there's plenty of them. Demanding more from their brands, giving brands suggestions, and they should do all of this in a really civil, friendly manner, because by shouting at someone from the outside, you're not really achieving something, but encouraging a brand to do better is going to be really impactful. I really believe the number one thing consumers can do is talk to brands and get them to do better.
That makes sense. And as a consumer of that brand is going to be more likely to listen and hear that.
Yeah.
That feedback for sure. So I'm curious, kind of jumping into kind of the business side of things, you turned to crowdsourcing to raise money for Ethique. What were some of the challenges in going that route, and what did you find to be successful?
Yeah, so back in 2015, equity crowdfunding had just been legalised in New Zealand. So this is the idea that you sell shares rather than rewards. I love the idea for a couple of reasons. One, not going to lie, it seemed easier and less terrifying than going out to angel investors. So this was talking to people who already loved your product and understood where you were trying to go without scary people in suits, which is honestly how I used to feel about it. That fear has gone away a little bit, but still, that was where I was. But the other aspect was really, really cool, was how you could get people who can't normally afford, or back then, it wasn't the accessibility around investing that there is today. So people who really wanted to back your journey and come along with you could invest in your company. And it was always my dream at the end of the day to pay off mortgages, which we've since done, which is very cool. So we did our first round in 2015. We did a second round in 2017. So at one point we had 352 shareholders, which is slightly tricky to manage to get that many people in a room, but we got there. But we raised, I think, 250,000 in the first round, or 200,000 in the first round, and we did that in 10 days. And the second round was a bit quicker. We raised 500,000, so $500,000, in 90 minutes, which was very cool.
That is wild. So, okay, so I'm so curious. Tell me more about this. So, what is this? Because in my brain, what I'm picturing is like a Kickstarter or something like that. But this sounds like maybe it's different. Where like these folks actually have ownership.
Yeah. I guess it's like a mini stock exchange. Is the only way I can really describe it. So there was levels of which people could invest, and it is more expensive to buy shares than it would be to buy, say, a reward. So our minimum investment amount was $500. We put together a massive IEM. There's a lot more financial information and a lot more due diligence that went into planning an equity raise than a Kickstarter style reward raise. And you have to be, the platform you use has to be registered with the FMA. It's all legal, financial, bleh. But that's good because it does give your investors quite a bit of protection. But yeah, the first round we sold about 16% of the company. And that means you just have this big group of cheerleaders who really want you to succeed for two reasons, right? It's very cool.
That is really, really cool. So for folks that are maybe interested in pursuing that, what would you have for recommendations in terms of like where to get started to learn more? Like, is that a unique platform that you use to New Zealand, or is it something that could be used in other countries? Or
yeah, so Pledge Me is who we used. There is a variety of platforms around. Pledge Me is in New Zealand and Australia. I am not certain about availability in America. I'd have to have a look, actually. If you wanted to go, the best place is platforms because they will run you through how to run a campaign. The things that I think worked in advance was the reason our second round was so much more successful. In 2015, not many people knew about us, but they appreciated the vision, and we put a lot into the visual storytelling and the authenticity of the story. We've always been a very authentic brand, so that's what got us through 2015. The second round, the reason we were so successful is because we achieved everything we said we were going to. You will see in so many investment rounds, both through crowdfunding or sort of the more typical routes, everyone has these massive forecasts, and I understand the temptation, but I have never operated that way. I would so much rather under-promise and over-deliver, even if that means you fetch a lower valuation, because then when you need money next, and businesses, startups are very money hungry, your investors will be so much more interested in helping you out. So it's really important to be realistic when you're going out on a raise, particularly. And the other thing, of course, too, you are playing with people's money. And when I said that these people can't typically invest because it's not as affordable or accessible, you need to take that with a great deal of responsibility. You know, it's very important that you look after those people and their money. So have a great visual brand, be really, really good at storytelling, and explain what you are trying to do, what you're trying to do. But be absolutely certain that the financial information you are giving is spot on and you are not over-exaggerating.
That makes sense. And I think that's great advice. How does the kind of first iteration of Ethique, I think it was Sorbet, differ from what we see now?
It's certainly visually very different. We used to have cool water soluble packaging, for example, but it turned out that wasn't actually as environmentally friendly as we thought, simply because it was very resource intensive. So you'd run it under the tap and the packaging would completely dissolve away. It was just cellulose, which was very cool. And that aspect was environmentally friendly, but the making of it used a lot more wood than ordinary cardboard. So we ditched that. So the branding has grown up a lot. We're obviously now a different company name. The big thing that hasn't changed is values, although we've added to them. So we started as a plastic-free company with social procurement policies. I find that really hard to say 3 times fast. Social procurement policies. But we've expanded, so over time we became palm oil free certified. I always try to avoid palm oil, but we took a really solid, aggressive stance against it in 2015, for example. So we've added to those values as we have understood how the world works a bit more. So our idealism has never changed, but we've learned more how to apply them in business. And also the range has expanded. We just started with shampoo and conditioner bars, and now we pretty much have everything from household to pet to baby to everything in the middle.
That's amazing. I know Britney Spears shared Ethique with her 30 million plus fans. That must have been quite the thrill.
That was a big few weeks, yeah. I think that was 2016. I'll probably never forget it. We had just been featured in Forbes. I was very excited when Forbes I met a Forbes reporter in Hawaii when I was on a women's leadership retreat. She reached out, did an interview, and I honestly thought this was going to set the world on fire and that everyone was going to read it because it's Forbes. So excited, a little bit naive. I didn't really know how the world worked back then. And about 4 people read it because they used to have a little counter at the bottom of their pages, and I was pretty devastated. But about a week later, I logged on in the morning to just this deluge of orders and emails and phone messages and Facebook messages. It was insane. And the Huffington Post had effectively reposted the interview and padded it out a bit, which was amazing, wonderful. 2 weeks of craziness ensued from that alone, and we had to cancel 98% of the orders. We had no way of fulfilling them. We were just 4 people at that point. It was manic. But then I woke up one morning to a text from my mother, and she has said, Britney Spears has shared you on Facebook. And I text back, and I'm a horrible person in the morning, and I text back, and they said, of course she hasn't. It'll be a clone account or some spam account. Don't be silly. And then she sent me a screenshot And there it was. And that was very cool because I am the generation that grew up listening to Britney Spears. I'm still a big fan of her music now. And it was, it was pretty surreal, I guess. And then Ashton Kutcher did it a couple of days later, but I didn't, he's wonderful. But Britney Spears was much more exciting to me.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's so great. And now Ethique is one of the highest rated, fastest selling shampoo and conditioner brands on Amazon. How does it feel after starting your business in a kitchen?
I guess you don't really think about it very often. That might sound a bit stupid, but I don't anyway. That's great because it's important to be highly rated because people don't buy sustainable products just because they're sustainable. If we're going to have a real impact and save 500 million bottles by 2030, we need people to like the product. So that's important. To me, I guess I sort of look at things I want to do more so than the things we've done, which is kind of a shame because sometimes you need to celebrate. But I think when it sinks in the most is when customers from around the world send in photos of products on shelves in their local retail store. That's pretty cool, like in Iceland or in Holland and Barrett in the UK or Boots, that's pretty cool. Or the Netherlands.
That's amazing. And speaking of future, let's talk a little about Ethique's plans for the future. 400,000 trees by the end of 2021 and 500 million plastic bottles saved from landfills by 2030. What does that look like? How
Terrifying.
Are you getting there?
I like bold goals because when I started, it was 1 million bottles saved by 2020, right? And we hit 10 million by 2020. So we hit that by a factor of 10. I'm not saying we'll do that again because that's too big. But I want an audacious goal because it makes the company, I have the most passionate, amazing, intelligent, switched-on team ever, and it gives them something to really strive for. It also gives consumers something to be inspired by and demand more of their brands, as we were talking about earlier. It just means growth, but it means sustainable growth. I've never been a fan. Look, I understand everybody runs their businesses differently, but I'm not a huge fan of the idea of injecting enormous amounts of capital, burning through it to grow fast, really, really fast, and then raising more money. You lose a lot of control that way. And I have always been very particular about control simply because I don't want to lose our values. That's very important. So we grow sustainably, but still very fast. And we are on track thus far with the right trajectory to hit those 500 million plastic bottles. The trees are nice and easy. We're actually going to probably up that, but I'm probably not allowed to say it yet.
So it sounds like 400,000 trees by the end of 2021. You're feeling good about?
Easy.
That's amazing. So as you've mentioned, you're a global brand based in New Zealand, right? Is that correct? Awesome. After I imagine after working with other companies kind of in the B Corp space and hearing of their experiences, is there anything different about your experience since being based in New Zealand, or do you feel like it's a pretty universal experience going through the B Corp?
We first did it a long time ago when it was really formative for us. So I talked about how we added in values as we grew, and that helped. That really added, it showed us best practice of what companies are doing offshore. So we don't have a legal structure of B Corps in New Zealand. I know it's being talked about by various people who are much cleverer than I, but we don't have that yet, whereas I know a lot of other companies do. So it's a bit different for us. There are some things that don't apply, but in general, it's just a really good measuring tool, I would say, and I think that's true of everyone who goes through that process. It's easier for us being a more values-based company from the day one rather than a company who's trying to retrofit. That would be much harder, and I think they deserve all of the applause in the world for trying that and giving that a go. I think that's amazing. But yeah, it hasn't. There's been some things that haven't applied to us simply because legally wise, New Zealand hasn't quite got there yet.
That makes sense. I'm curious. So you've been certified as a B Corp since 2015. What made you pursue certification, and why do you feel like it's important to continue to recertify?
Oh, ironically, I met New Zealand's first B Corp. I don't know why I reached out to him, but he sells plastic gloves. So literally sells. and makes single-use plastic, which is hilarious. But without question, those are necessary for medical facilities, for science, right? They're a legal requirement. And he wanted to make an environmentally and socially responsible company to sell a product that is necessary. And he really inspired me. He was the first B Corp in New Zealand. I met a few people who were talking about it or liked the idea. It was still very early days. But I just really liked the idea of showing consumers we meant what we said, but also having that benchmark. I knew very little about business. I just had all this idealism. So how do you translate that into actual business practices? And that was what B Corp was for me back then. And as for recertifying, much the same, because it gets harder every year. They continually refresh the assessment. So a lot of companies will either hold their score or drop rather than increase, because it's hard. And I guess because there's a bit of competition in there, we've always been New Zealand's highest scoring B Corp. As we got pipped to the post, I think in March this year, by an amazing company in New Zealand called Chia Sisters. We're halfway through recertification right now. And I'm not saying, I want to beat them or anything, because that's not the point of it. But I think the reason we keep going every year and trying harder is probably a little bit of my personal competitiveness. It's something businesses should do. We talk about sustainable business. I kind of almost think we're past that now. Sustainable means doing something, keeping something as it is, right? Our environment can't stay as it is. It needs to get better. Really, we are at the stage we need to start thinking about businesses being regenerative and giving back much more. And B Corp is a way to make that easier for the business because it gives you a framework.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm curious too, what was the name of the glove company?
Oh, no. I know you're going to edit this. I can Google it if you like. What are they called?
Oh, no worries. I can always find it later. I just didn't know if you know off the top of your head. No sweat.
I've forgotten. That's terrible. I'll find that out for you.
No worries. So I know your original BIA score was a whopping 105.7, which I feel like is really high for your first go at it. And your current score is 117.1. How are you able to so drastically increase your score?
Our next one's higher again, too. I can't tell you what it is officially yet because it's got to be verified. But again, I think it's easier for us because realistically, we have tried to do this from day one. And I have a very supportive board and a very supportive investor and a team that is massively on board with all of these values. So it's not a hard sell for us. And whenever someone in the team comes up with a new initiative we want to apply or a new way of doing something, it's easier for us to implement. So that's probably a big part of the reason is I have a much more supportive environment than probably a typical business does, where things are first and foremost still measured against what that will do for the bottom line. That's changing, though. Businesses, by and large, are certainly starting to look at the idea of a triple bottom line that bit more.
Absolutely. I'm curious, what advice would you have for, other folks that are either recertifying or thinking about certifying for the first time, especially since you've been through the certification a few times now? Are there any things that you find make it easier going to like recertification or even for the first go?
Give yourself time. So start the assessment early. If you're recertifying and you've got 2 months before your certification is up, you should have started 4 months ago. B Corp, which is great, have an enormous backlog. So I think we finished our assessment in March. It's just because so many people are interested in being a B Corp, it's taken a bit longer to move through all the backlog. So start early so that your certification doesn't expire, and give yourself time to go through that assessment and get all the verification documents without having to panic and stress yourself out, because maybe you're leaving points on the table simply because you didn't think something through. I guess that's probably what I would say there, is give yourself more time than you think you'll need. And don't use it as we're not doing very well. Use it as great, we're doing this well, but these are all the things we can do better. A lot of people use it as my business isn't very good. And I don't think that's the way to look at it. Businesses that are looking at B Corp are already probably vastly better than organizations that aren't. So you shouldn't look at it as a failure. You should look at it as an opportunity.
Absolutely. It's a journey for sure.
100%.
And I think it's one that we're all on forever in theory.
Absolutely. No business is perfect. We have so many things we could do better. And that's what the B Corp assessment will teach us.
Absolutely. What has been the most rewarding aspect of being part of the B Corp community?
I think it's like-minded businesses, because any business owner or leader in business will tell you the same thing. It can be really lonely. You should never, well, I don't believe you, depending on your relationship with your team, I don't believe you should share your concerns and worries with them. Friends and family, whilst well-meaning, may not understand quite so much. And it's really nice to be able to talk these things through with people who are going through something very similar. It's a peer group, but a values-based peer group who will be going through the same thing, understand where you are, have ideas, but are all coming at it from a really supportive point of view. Oh my God, the world can be the most negative, nasty place, particularly online. And it's a really refreshing community, really.
Absolutely. So in addition to B Corp certification, you have a myriad of other certifications as well for conscientious consumers and so on. What are some of your favorite certifications that you would encourage other people to be on the lookout for as consumers?
I'm a big fan of palm oil free. Palm oil is an interesting one. It is environmentally devastating. It's devastated the ancient forests of Indonesia and Malaysia, and now it's moving into parts of Africa. It's not only environmentally destructive, it's also socially destructive, because it removes a lot of community farms. It basically enslaves a lot of people in really poor work practices, and there's some really, really big organizations behind this that do it. It's also got a real dark side that most people don't know about. So anti-palm oil activists, like a lot of environmental activists, often go missing, which is just not something I'm interested in supporting. But a lot of people don't know this, right? And it's in about 50% of your supermarket products, about 95% of your cosmetic products. It's not listed necessarily as palm oil, but it's what all your things like your surfactants, which is what makes your shampoo foam, your emulsifiers, which makes your cream a cream. It's in those. It's what forms the backbone of those ingredients. So it's ubiquitous. The problem being, if we had a mass boycott of palm oil, we would create a worse environmental problem, because we would then have to use coconut oil, which is much less efficient. So the solution is to fix the palm oil production. There's not really any signs of that occurring right now. I know there are people working on it, and I'm sure that they are doing good work. But to me right now, it's not there. So we don't use it at all, which is very difficult. So consumers, I do believe, should look out for the palm oil free certification. There's a few of them now. It's growing in steam. The other one, of course, cruelty free, without question. There's absolutely no excuse for using animal testing for any kind of cosmetic purpose whatsoever. And then I think what you'll start to see a lot more of is carbon certifications, climate positive, or carbon negative, which means that company offsets more carbon than they emit, which is what we do, or carbon neutral. Climate change, I think most people realize that that's a thing we should be concerned about, and the concern there is making people apathetic by the idea that they can't do anything. And I know, look, you cannot consciously shop your way out of this, but by making good choices, you are signaling to your brands, who have real power again, you are signaling to brands that is something that consumers care about. So those are probably the big certifications I'd look out for. I know I'll think of a new one as soon as we're over.
That's fair. Of those certifications, what do you think has been the hardest or most challenging certification process, and which have been kind of the most rewarding?
Palm oil was the hardest, because every manufacturer of cosmetic ingredients use palm oil. So we had to have stuff made for us specially. We had to convince them that it was financially viable, and we could only do so when we got to a certain scale. So, but because of that, and because of that demand, now manufacturers are offering palm-free solutions to smaller companies, which is a great change to see. So that was without question the hardest. It took months and months and months, and I actually think quite a lot of stress from the product team and I. The most rewarding, I'm going to go back to probably the B Corp one. It's the most widely recognized, but it's the widest. So not only does it show you all the things you need to do that you should be doing better, but it does give you a feeling of, you know what, I am doing well in this area, So it's rewarding to see what is best practice internationally and whether you're doing that or not. It's not the easiest.
It's definitely comprehensive. That's for sure.
That's a great word for it.
I'm curious, talking about palm oil, do you think that is a problem that could be solved with something like a fair trade certification?
Yes.
Or why do you think that that's something that, it being the large problem that it is, we just haven't found some good solutions for?
I think it's a very complicated topic that I'm not nearly educated enough to talk about. There is government interests, there is big corporate interest, which will be fundamentally against what people are trying to do. So there is the RSPO, which is sustainably sourced palm oil. It has a lot of loopholes. It's certainly not perfect, but it's the start of a good framework. So it's better than nothing in some ways, and hopefully that continues to build and get stronger. For me, what I would like to do, but going back to the idea of visiting growers and producers, for me, this will need to wait until we can travel a bit more, is working with producers and growers to set up a palm oil cooperative, a big one. That would be what I would want to do. But that would be a massive undertaking. But I think that's the way to start changing the industry. The problem you're always going to have there is cost. And people expect palm oil is an incredibly cheap additive. It's about, I think you can get it for as low as 50 cents a kg. It is phenomenally cheap, and to make something fair trade, of course, you're then paying more for it, and you've got to convince corporates to do so without passing the cost on to consumers, and it's very complicated, as is everything.
Sounds like it. Would starting a cooperative be would it be similar to what we see happening with like cacao and coffee, where like they have co-ops? Is it like, would that
Yes.
be the same kind of idea?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So you would have
cool.
family communities, or however they wanted to structure it, who were in charge of their own destiny, and they weren't dictated by commodity pricing.
That's really cool. Well, we look forward to if or when you explore that.
I would love to.
I'd be excited to
one day.
to follow you on that journey. Anything else that you want to add, that you want listeners to know about, that maybe, as consumers or even as entrepreneurs?
I think it goes back to what I've touched on a few times, is people are often overwhelmed and they feel apathetic about what feels like this. I mean, could anything else go further wrong the last few years? I totally get how people are feeling. But it's really important to remember that we can make change, we can affect positive change, and we should try to do so. If you're going to take it to the worst degree, wouldn't you rather go down fighting anyway? Would you, this idea that we've hit all these tipping points with the climate crisis, for example, and why bother doing anything? It's not the way to look at it. Things can get a lot worse, and we can still avert that. Things can get a lot worse for people in general. We can avert that through our buying decisions and encouraging brands to do better, because I really do believe that businesses have power. So to consumers, I say you use your voice. Yes, you can make changes in your life which will make a difference, but the biggest difference you can make is by working with brands, by telling them what you want, and they can make better choices, which will be much larger scale. For entrepreneurs, make those choices. If you want to start a business, and I love that so many people are wanting to start businesses now, and so many of them are values-led, you should only start a company if it is a net positive for the world and not just a reason to make money, because consumers are not interested in helping you get rich anymore. They demand better. They want brands that care and reflect their social values.
As they should.
Absolutely.
That's awesome. Oh my goodness. Brianne, thank you so much. This has been great.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.